Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our two renowned speakers today, who we're very delighted are joining us. Degan is an internationally renowned humanitarian leader and organizational development consultant. She's been at the forefront of shifting power for decades. She's a Rockefeller Foundation Global Fellow for Social Innovation, a contributor to the Overseas Development Institute Humanitarian Policy Group, and the Global Food Security Journal. She's been featured in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and The Guardian. Degan leads an organization called Adeso, which made cash transfers a significant and legitimate method of delivering aid to vulnerable populations, beginning with the first large-scale cash transfer during the Somalia famine in 2011. She helped to establish the target of 20% localization, which evolved into the UN's 25% grand bargain commitment, although we know we're nowhere near that, and hopefully we'll be discussing a bit more later. She's the architect and founder of the Network for Empowered Aid Response, the first global civil society organization in the South advocating for the transformation of humanitarian and development aid architecture. Degan lives in Kenya and works with organizations across the global North and global South. Simeon is a dynamic professional currently serving as the challenge lead for children in displacement at Porticus. Simeon has a background in development management, media studies, and human rights. He's passionate about addressing critical social issues, particularly those affecting vulnerable populations, including children, migrants, and refugees. Known for his exceptional ability to connect people, ideas, and perspectives, I can vouch for that, Simeon excels in bringing diverse perspectives and fostering collaboration. This makes him an incredible asset in the field of philanthropy and social impact. Simeon's approach is characterized by an entrepreneurial spirit, emphasizing solidarity with marginalized communities and a vision for a more positive future. As a leader for change and a true world citizen, his work at Porticus reflects his dedication to reimagining and realizing impactful solutions, focusing on effecting systemic change. I'd like to welcome you both to the panel today. And first of all, I'd like to just get to know you both a bit better and to understand what brought you into this field of work. What was your motivation and how does this spur you on today? Degan, shall we start with you?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you today. Thank you, Tricia, for inviting me. I think my motivation is very personal for me. It's actually my mother. She was the founder of Adeso, and she was an environmental activist. And she is an environmental activist. It's funny, when I came into the space, into this field, I wanted to work for the UN. My idea of success, my metrics, my imagination was that being a UN employee would be where I made it. I got a taste of the UN, and I left pretty quickly, very disillusioned. And will never go back, ever. And I think for me, what has spurred my activism in the space was going from really a position of credibility, respect, automatic integrity. All of these things were given to you all the time being a UN staffer. You got access to spaces, your data was never questioned, the potential that you could be nepotistic or corrupt, never even fathomed. Your integrity was always intact. I had access to ministers as a 28-year-old that I shouldn't have had. I was like, why am I meeting a minister as a 28-year-old junior staff? But this was the arrogance of being in the UN. I should have the right to meet a minister as a 28-year-old. And then working for a very small local NGO with my mother, where I was the complete opposite. I was treated with constant suspicion, told that your data is not credible, that you are potentially corrupt, my integrity constantly questioned. It was actually assumed that I was corrupt. It was guilty until proven innocent all the time, and it still is, actually. And then not getting access to spaces. As a Somali working in Somalia, I was denied access to rooms talking about Somalia response, talking about the situation in Somalia. And I saw my mother in that situation, and I said, I have to help her. I have to support her. Because this work was so exhausting and so dehumanizing that I knew that if I didn't help her, it was gonna kill her potentially. And she eventually did have strokes, actually. She had many strokes. But she's alive, alhamdulillah. But so that was what made me realize, and I'm so grateful for having been at the UN, because I don't think I would have seen the disconnect, the two realities, how they're so far apart from each other if I hadn't had that experience. I think I would have gone into the space with a very naive, idealistic way of thinking and not knowing what the other side, how the other side was treated and lived. So that is actually, so I have a very personal reason for why I do what I do, because I've seen both sides, and I have been and continue to be treated with such level of questioning of my integrity. And I think that's the worst. I don't think the access to spaces is the worst part of this. I think it's when your integrity is questioned. That is, like, to me, there's nothing worse than that you can do up to a person. So that's what motivates me, and making sure that Global South local organizations like us don't go through that every single day, which they are, sadly, and figuring out how to change the system so that we stop this behavior that is very colonial, that's very racist.
Thank you, Degan. And Simeon?
Good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here and to be sharing once again the platform with Degan. I'm always inspired and awed by what you have achieved, and also what still lays ahead, that we can all join forces and see how we can transform society and development. So my journey is a simple one. I never saw myself as a person from the South. I just saw myself as a human. So I was born and bred in Zimbabwe, just as a human being. But as a young person in the mid-90s, I found myself with others challenged by a very repressive state. So we started to imagine solutions around fixing that state. And our vehicle was human rights. So I was part of building the first locally led grassroots. We didn't have all these labels. We just wanted a solution. So we thought, let's come together, multiple talents of the country. We didn't have any foreign sponsorship, but we were like, oh my goodness, this can't be. These liberators of our country are oppressing us, and we need to find a way of pushing back, of holding them accountable. We started questioning that state. So we built a movement of, at least at that time, Zimbabwe is a tiny country. I think we were just above 9 million people. So we built a movement of 15,000 active people who were in villages, who were on workshop, in shop floors, people who were in schools, at universities. So we all came together to build that grassroots movement. And then along, everybody came in solidarity. But that movement kind of gave a new vision for the country beyond the liberation. To say, yes, we have ended colonialism, but how do we free ourselves from local oppressions? So that was my journey. So in that journey, I was part of ZimRights. Some of you might have heard of it, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association. From there on, I started being active within the regional space, within Southern Africa. And I was quite a young man. And again, like Degan, I found myself in those spaces, but not through invitation, but recognition of the work that we had done as a collective at the national level. And now we're beginning to inspire others within the region. And then fast forward, I found myself in an international human rights groups, again, carrying on these issues, investigating human rights violations of various marginalized groups. And I really felt that I needed to be a voice. I needed to do lots of solidarity, but also to open spaces for others to participate in decision making, to amplify the work of the local human rights defenders. And after doing so much in terms of human rights research, I think my last piece of work in human rights was investigating the killings of people with albinism in Malawi, which was very painful, but also recognizing that there were many grassroots voices that were out there that the world was not connecting with. And we wanted to really help them to be connected, to be resourced, to be recognized, and to start occupying the spaces where decisions were being made with regards to their own welfare, but also in terms of the trajectory of their own country. And then I found myself in a philanthropic organization. But again, in that philanthropic organization, we started to question ourselves. We started to inspire ourselves, to connect with our partners, to also try to reimagine ourselves as a philanthropic organization and how we can be in true solidarity with the people that we serve. So that's my journey to here.
Thank you. And I'm curious to understand from both of you how you would define a rebalancing of the system. What would a locally led system look like? I've heard some words from both of you that I think might sort of weave through this. So I've heard about integrity as a critical factor, and that links also, I think, to accountability, solidarity, and self-determination, which of course requires voice and participation. What are the diverse aspects of a locally led system? What would you like to see if you could refashion it in the way that you think it should function?
I think first of all, I would like to see a system where Africa and the global South in general is sovereign from global North institutions and everywhere. I think the global architecture, I always talk about this. This is why I personally use the term decolonization rather than locally led or anything else. Because the reason we need philanthropy, the reason we need aid, the reason we need all of this is because of the underpinnings, the foundational system that has been created that makes Africa be a source of extraction of raw materials that they sell back to us at 3 times the price. The fact that 75% of the African continent, all the countries in the continent pay 75% of their revenue towards debt. Kenya is paying debt off that was incurred by the British colonial government. So the fact that we're paying 18, 20% interest rate on our debt while the global North countries pay a fraction of that. The whole system is rigged to ensure that we don't have resources for humanitarian response, that we don't have resources for our health and education services for our citizens and all of this. So that we are dependent then on OECD donors, on ODA, we're dependent on the generosity of philanthropists, we're dependent on all of this. So I would like to see a system where we're not dependent anymore. And that support in the world is based on mutual solidarity. So we can see a system, we can see a future where Ghanaian citizens are paying money to a response in Louisiana. Like, why can't we imagine that? But that should be the world where we should be talking about. People will be needing support all the time for the rest. This is just normal. There will be disasters, there will be problems, but it should be mutual solidarity rather than this assumption that we are always the recipients and white folks are always the donors, right? So this is the situation I would like to see change, where we are supporting each other based on that sense of humanity rather than because we actually need it and we're always the ones in poverty. So I'd like to flip the whole system around completely, up on its head. I wouldn't like to see the UN agencies be operational anymore. I would like to see that global governments are able to take care of the needs of its citizens. I would like to see civil society doing the work of what it was supposed to do, both in the North and in the South. And right now, civil society in the North, INGOs, are not civil society. They are just subcontractors of their government. They're no longer civil society. So, and that is to hold the private sector and their governments accountable and not doing service delivery. Service delivery should be done by the governments. And we in the South have gotten used to being pawns of the system and going where the money is. And where's the money? The money is in service delivery. That money is not in advocacy. It's not in transparency and accountability. There's very little resources for that, right? So, but we need to get out of the business of being service deliverers. So these are the kinds of, I think, essential foundational ingredients to reimagine that system. Is let's talk about what that vision has to be based on some realities. And that reality, honestly, is economic, financial, and political self-determination for the South.
We saw this in the transition of the sort of, the UK aid funding to sort of contracting, and the gagging clauses that were included that prevented, any criticism of government practices. So we can see that this has been a consistent trend. And I know, Simeon, that this is something that you're actively working within a philanthropic foundation to explore, challenge, transform. It would be really interesting to hear your perspective about the journey that I know you're working with Porticus on.
Yeah, as a philanthropy, we are also reimagining ourselves in a way that will take us closer to true solidarity with the people that we serve. So as a foundation, we are looking at how do we form true partnership with people with lived experience of any social issue that we are looking at. How do we support, as a foundation, those people in their own journeys, in their quest for solutions? Of course, we are a funder. We have funding that we direct. So, as a foundation, we see that lived experience is often not recognized as an important ingredient in finding solutions. And one of the things we are supporting is to really see how we can direct resources to refugee-led organizations to be innovators on issues that are affecting them. But often at par with the INGOs, with the IGOs, being able directly to engage in advocacy around migration issues, rather than being people who just receive services of these agencies. We are also looking at this kind of what you could call disruptive actions, even in the refugee education spaces, where refugee-led organizations are reimagining the education of their children. They are going into partnership with national NGOs, with INGOs, and we probably are taking a much softer approach in terms of addressing these power imbalances. And in terms of addressing these power imbalances, we have also looked at ourselves. We have had a very difficult conversation. We are a family foundation. So we talked also amongst our governors in terms of how do we imagine ourselves in this situation where we can recognize meaningful engagement by people that we serve in our own governance systems, in our own granting processes, where participation is seen as a right and not just a methodology, where we can just tick the boxes that people were in the room, but we also want to question the quality of that engagement. So a number of innovations have come in. Part of it's directly funding refugee-led organizations for the first time, looking at our own funding requirements, our own due diligence processes, which keep certain groups of innovators away from the resources. We are on a journey also looking at our own governance system. We are a family foundation, in the past solely made up of family members. One of our society sectors has just announced that they are onboarding two wonderful Kenyan women, one of them an indigenous woman, to be a member of the board, 2 members of the board. In our education sector, we are also looking at how we can bring in also people with lived experience and other expertise into this, into our governance system. So that's how, as a foundation, we are trying to walk the talk. We know that this is a much bigger question, but we can model, and whatever we model, we share with the wider philanthropic society so that others can join, and then maybe together we can build enough force to transform society and to transform international development.
It always amazes me that it's not sort of self-evident that people are the experts on their own realities, and that's where you start. If you're trying to address an issue, you start with the people who are experiencing that issue to understand what their perception is on what solutions they would like to see. It's very inspiring to hear about the work that you're doing with and through Porticus. What can international NGOs, what's the role of international NGOs and maybe other donors to support this transition? Simeon.
I think the first is a need to self-reflect. As Degan said, we need to also understand the history of where we are all coming from, and also to have this uncomfortable, or to enjoy the discomfort of this conversation. Looking at, in 2024, do we need to have systems that are dominated by outsiders in terms of providing solutions? Do we not have enough capacity, or at least strong capacity, to address some of the social, economic, or political issues that affect the societies that we serve? So a self-reflection, I think, within the INGO community, reimagining or rethinking itself is critical as a start. But it also has to be an honest conversation, that conversation that also brings into people both of the North and the South in that reflection. So, and also for some of the philanthropic organizations, I think what we are good at is we are agile. We can move fast in terms of making decisions. We can model, we can build evidence of what works and what doesn't work, and we can produce it as a public good for the rest of the world to showcase. That's why I'm quite excited to be talking to Degan and other innovators, so that we can really start to showcase what the future can be. I think people are overwhelmed sometimes by the guilt, and because you are questioning, decades of practice that could have done so much harm, and we are talking accountability. Yeah. But people often also need to see the future in action, and I think from a philanthropic point of view, we can model, and that's why as Porticus, we are not closed to sharing our own journey. We are not sharing it because we want everybody to say, wow, look, they are on this path. We're actually sharing because we want more to join. We are not there yet, and we invite criticism on our own approaches, because without that, we can never be what we are aspiring to be.
I'm going to pause for a second to see if there's any questions or reflections from the audience. So we're going to structure this as a series of sort of, interventions, and then people, please feel free to, we've got a few minutes, if anybody would like to share any reflections that they may have at this point.
Alana Benin, International Rescue Committee, pleasure to meet you. You suggested, Degan, doing away with the UN system, and that's a really interesting proposal, because I'm just trying to understand, what would that look like? Like, does that mean tomorrow, how do we shut the UN's doors? Like, how do we just shut down all those operations? Obviously, that would have tremendous implications for people, maybe in the short term bad, but in the long term good. But yeah, do you have operationalized thoughts on how that would be executed?
And thank you for those very critical reflections on the whole system and architecture of aid and development as it works. So what are your thoughts on the role of national NGOs and civil society towards making this change to happen? Like this vision of changed infrastructure. So what role do you see for the civil society, locally led organizations in this, and how they can contribute? Thank you.
So on the UN, honestly, we don't have to do much. The UN is collapsing in front of our eyes. Okay. International human rights law, everything that has been constructed post-World War III is collapsing in front of our eyes. And Gaza is doing that very well. So I don't have much hope, honestly, unless the US government does something very dramatic in the next 1 year, maybe 2 maximum. I don't think they have a lot of time to bring back some level of belief in the international world order and the international system. I'm not hopeful, but if something dramatic happens, then I can see the UN being saved. But right now, as it stands, it has no credibility and no legitimacy. And if you look at what has been happening with the BRICS nations, things have been moving very fast in the past few years. They went from initially looking at just joining each other on economic policies to actually doing a joint currency, and now to political issues. And it wouldn't surprise me if BRICS becomes its own UN system that is parallel to the current UN. And the colonial architecture, some of it is the veto power. Everybody is angry about the veto power, and everybody knows that because of the veto power, we have not solved one crisis in the past 30 years. Not one has been solved. Whether you talk about the Congo, whether you talk about Sudan, whether you talk about Iraq, whether you talk about Libya, it's just, it's a farce, and we all know it. And so I think the UN is on its last legs, unless something dramatic happens soon. Now, what would that mean? I don't honestly think that we're going to miss much, honestly. I know there's a lot of people in this machinery who are dependent on it for their salaries, including local staff, a lot of national staff. The elites of our societies in the South are UN employees. The elites of our societies are INGO employees, right? So there's a lot of people who are benefiting from this very broken system. And I'm not saying it does nothing. There's a lot of things that it does do good. UNRWA is the lifeline of many Palestinians. If UNRWA didn't exist, many Palestinians would be dying. But at the same time, we also know all the other things that I've just spoken about. So that's my feedback on it. I think practically how operationally that a new system will happen, I think it's going to happen. If it happens, it's going to happen through BRICS. So what is the role of local NGOs to help change this system? I think that the problem with local leaders, including myself, and I put myself in this category, when I joined Adeso in 2003, and I had just left the UN, my metrics of success was to become like a mini INGO. I wanted to expand, and I wanted to break through all the glass ceilings, and we were very successful. We were the first Somali NGO to get USAID funding, Dutch funding, Swiss funding, all of them, EU funding. And we grew from $400,000 annual income, very small grassroots organization, to becoming 21 million in a very short, less than 10 years. It was massive growth very quickly. It was unhealthy growth. And we made the opposite decision in 2018 because of our experiences with USAID and some of the other donors to do the opposite, to shrink. And we went from being 21 million and over 300 staff to being 15 staff and $2 million. And we made a decision to stop taking bilateral funding because it was so restrictive, it was so top-down, it was just impossible. And then in 2020, we made a decision to stop taking UN funding. And in 2022, we made a decision to stop taking INGO funding. To the point my mother was like, okay, why don't you just shut down Adeso? Like, you're just going to destroy this organization. Everybody. And my peers in the Somali community, the NGO leaders who looked at Adeso as a role model of what they aspired to, thought I was crazy. And one of the biggest problems I see in our space is that we are colonized. We are so colonized as Global South actors. And I see them thinking that I look at them and I'm like, oh my God, I wish you knew what I know. How could I convince you that this path that you're going down is not a good path? It's not healthy for you. not only does it disconnect you from the communities, I don't know what that sweet spot is, where you are big enough that you are successful, quote unquote, but at the same time you still maintain connection to the communities. I tell you, I was not traveling to communities anymore. I was more in the offices, in the hallways of donors, right? So I was servicing donors. I wasn't servicing my people anymore. And so, but that is also where the money is. The money is in service deliveries and cash programs and all of these things. We pioneered cash in 2003. Now we don't do any cash programming because I've seen what cash has done to the Somali population. Lazy cash programming done by the UN and INGOs has created massive amounts of dependency. And I'm anti-cash now. And people get shocked by that. I'm completely anti. Why? Because something good in the hands of people who are lazy can be destructive. And that's what the system is. It's very lazy, cookie cutter, copy and paste. Take this cash program in Somalia and take it to Iraq, take it to Afghanistan, take it to Syria, take it whatever. That's how the system works. There is nothing that is led by the grassroots. And that's why we stopped taking INGO funding, because they would come to us with cash programs and we're like, this is not appropriate. We need to stop this. And can we design something here that is appropriate? They're like, oh no, it was already approved in The Hague. It was already approved in London. We can't go back to the donor. The Germans have already approved it. I'm like, no, stop. At some point, we needed the money because we kept saying no to all of these funders. We didn't know how to keep our lights on, how to pay salaries. Honestly, there were times I wasn't sure if we were going to continue to exist. But you have to be principled. And I'm sorry to say many of us cannot make those hard decisions. And that is, you have to model that behavior. I can't say and talk about decolonization if I don't decolonize Adeso and my own self. So it has to start with you, and then it has to start with your own institution.
It's difficult to follow up well after Degan has spoken about things, but she speaks so many things that resonate. But I think for us, it's much more practical, on the ground, and also reflecting on who we are as a foundation. So for us, I think that's what Degan talked about. Having everything centered around the donor. And that's also something that we are seeking to change. That let's center our support around the issues that the partners are engaging with. Whether the partners is a national NGO or a refugee-led organization or a community-based organization. So we have been on a journey of rolling back some of these barriers to access funding, barriers around reporting, focusing on pleasing or meeting the donor requirements, but really trying to help our partners to work towards changing and also claiming their spaces in decision making. So less support towards service delivery. I think a lot of our support is going towards system change, advocacy, the kind of work with refugee-led organizations, being able to sit and engage with government, make sure that we are resourcing them, and also as a funder to recognize that change is not only brought by money, that the power that we have from being able to sign the check is not the most important ingredient for change. There are so many assets that our partners bring, the sacrifices that they do, the experience that they do. When I sit with refugee leaders, I'm probably the least qualified person in the room on how to address, for example, immigration laws in South Africa. But we need to resource them in ways that do not force them to mimic the INGOs, to mimic some of these international development models, but to actually find strength in their own experience. And that experience is not only recognized by us, but by others as well. And we have seen some very interesting, promising results, where, for example, a Nigerian refugee leader in South Africa manages to grab the mic and highlight the issues that are affecting women who are migrants in South Africa with regards to policies, access to services. And immediately you see the government listening. You see, the ministers want to talk to that refugee leader. And for me, that's what we are contributing. We are resourcing that leader not to just spend 90% of their time reporting to Porticus, filling in application forms, but let's make it as simple as possible so that they can focus on the change that they need in their own communities. And then document it, build the evidence on what works. And then we can share on platforms like this and with other philanthropists to say, please come and see how a different world can be created, and we are building these small ripples across the world. So totally agree with Degan, but also I think my contribution is more at a practical, as a small foundation that is trying to reimagine a future where we can elevate the work of local leaders. The importance of local initiatives that are inspired by the realities of the people who are on the margins of our societies.
So I'm really curious to dig a bit deeper, because I hear what you're saying about resourcing powerful advocates as activists for change, and that's critically important. And I'm also hearing what you're saying about the challenge of supporting local organisations to decolonise the way that they approach the whole system because of the way that they've been embedded within that system, and the fact that they have no control over the design of the system itself. But surely to create sustainable local change, we need sustainable local organisations. And so what would they look like? And what would INGOs, what's the role of INGOs within this? Is there a role, or is the ambition to make this system completely redundant in all of its current forms? I'm curious to understand that a bit better.
So I remember in 2016 going to a philanthropist before we said we weren't going to take USAID funding. I went to a philanthropist, I won't name the foundation, and I said, please give us money so I can say no to USAID. And it took, until 2 years ago before we got that funding. And that's the first multi-year core funding we have as an organization. We're 32 years old, 33 years old, and that was the first multi-year core funding we got as an organization. It took how many years to get it? So my point is, if we really want the Adesos, many thousands of organizations, like you've asked, local organizations, to change the system and to make those brave decisions, to make those principled decisions, we need to give them unrestricted funding. And even more radical, we need to help them get endowments. Yeah? I know that's politically incorrect in the global north, sitting with fat endowments that only spend 5% of what they're supposed to, legally in the US, that's all you're required to spend is 5%. And I think a lot of people think that's just very colonial and all of this language that has been used and blah, blah, blah. But that's a privileged position. When you're hungry and you ain't got nothing, you need an endowment to survive. Yeah? You need that. So I would love to see every local organization out there, especially key leaders in the space, be endowed so that they have at least something, so that if they don't get 6 months, 1 year of funding, and they stop and they make a principled position, they're going to survive. They're not going to close down. So if we are serious, and this is where philanthropy comes in. You asked earlier, Tricia, what is the role of philanthropy? Philanthropy is that risk taker that can do these kinds of things that bilaterals will not do. Yeah. So that's in response to that. And for Adeso right now, our shift, I didn't know how we were going to make it happen in 2018 when we stopped taking bilateral money. But now we are on the path to financial sustainability. We are starting, like every single initiative I start, we're really good at coming up with new ideas as an organization. So we're starting new things all the time. But I tell my team, we're not starting anything that's not financially sustainable. I don't want to have anything be asking for money in 10 years. My goal is in 10 years that whatever we start has to be financially sustainable. So we are starting businesses or social enterprises like Kuja, which I can talk about later. We have a water company in Somalia that's providing cheap, clean water to people's homes like the municipalities do or private companies do in the West. We have an apartment building that we're constructing in Nairobi. So all of these initiatives we're not there yet. We're still 100% dependent on philanthropic money right now. But I hope, inshallah, God willing, that in the next 5 years, these businesses will start reaping some fruits and we'll start getting some revenue so that we can start making a dent on our endowment. I would love a donor to come in and say, I'm going to give you a $20 million check to start your endowment. That would be amazing. But I know it's not going to happen. So what are we doing? We're actually starting businesses that hopefully will generate revenue towards that endowment. And that's a longer path towards financial sustainability than having grants, philanthropists willing to give you money for your endowment.
Thank you, Degan. And I think, I mean, it's this question, isn't it, of reducing dependency and sort of, self-sustainability, self-determination. It reflects back on the reflections that you've both made at the beginning. I know, Grace, did you want to ask a question? Is the mic still there? You've got it. Brilliant. Okay.
Hi, I'm Grace. I'm with the Arab Network for Early Childhood, and I come from Lebanon. So I know firsthand what it looks like to have a government, an educational system, economical system crumple in front of us. My question is twofold, and it's actually 4 questions, so excuse me. So seeing what happened in Lebanon and in the Arab region, I've noticed and seen firsthand how the people lost trust in the governments. And although it definitely is the job of these governments to do what these UN agencies, international NGOs, and even civil societies are doing, we do notice that sometimes the citizens and the people do not trust the government. So the first part of the question is, would they trust the government, and what would it take for the for people to trust the government, knowing that there are political agendas? And like, I can give one brief example that the government and politicians show up in Lebanon just before elections and give and throw money just so that they get votes. So how much would the people actually trust, and what would it take to build this trust? And we also know that these governments can be racist, so how much will they be fair towards refugees, whether internally displaced or from other countries? On the second level, which is the second part of the big question, we do know that even governments get funding from the global north. And we do know that sometimes this funding is also conditional. So how do we decolonize that funding? And to go back on the sentence that, yes, people do trust UN agencies more than they trust the civil society that is literally from them. Do you think that the funding source influences how people view the organization that is doing any type of initiative? So, yeah.
Thank you, Grace. I'm going to ask Simeon to respond to that first part of the question about trust and democratic accountability.
I'm not sure I have a straight answer. We don't work on issues around governance, government systems, and so forth. But I think what we promote in terms of our work in education or our work around dealing with societal issues is really empowering people with lived experience of those issues so that they can have agency, so that they are resourced to engage with other system players, including government, including UN agencies, and bring evidence and insights from their own experience and try to influence that. One could say it's a bit naive, but that's how society, when you are not represented, and if some people are sitting around the table and deciding your fate, it's worse probably if you are there and you are able to bring to the attention of those decision makers, or if at best be joint decision makers. That's what we are trying to contribute towards. So I gave an example of our work where refugee leaders are able, for example, in Kenya, in Kakuma, to showcase to the INGOs, to the UN agencies, that actually refugee organizations are a critical innovator, and they actually produce impactful work that is also forcing the UN agencies and forcing the INGOs to reimagine their own relationships with these organizations, because sometimes relationships matter, and unless you are bringing something to the table, people will always look at you skeptically. But what we are seeing, and I see Cassie is in the room here, the work that they are doing in Kakuma is a game changer for the humanitarian sector. But it has only been enabled because they are getting direct funding to do this work, and not through a UN agency or another intermediary through an INGO. So for me, it's about agency, recognizing the power from the people who are affected, but also for those with power and philanthropic organizations, we do have power. How we use that power is critical. We need to use that power responsibly and not abuse it, and not to colonize others, but to enable others who are on the margins of power to be able to reclaim their positions on the table.
Thank you, Simeon, and that's a fantastic plug for our next session. If we've got an incredible presentation coming from some of the RLOs in Kakuma, talking about the innovations that they're leading. Degan, over to you. How would you?
Yeah, so trust lost of the government by the citizens. First of all, I think that trust is lost because the citizens don't receive the basics, right? The social contract between a government and its citizens is predicated on basic, like meeting your, what do they call it, Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? So if you don't have the basic needs met, it's very difficult to think about political action or advocacy. So one of the things I'm always very unhappy about is how much money the Global North donors, government donors, put into governance, democracy, corruption. Corruption, I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's another issue, but good governance, right? At the same time, every single time that we have a really good, radical African leader, they're assassinated, right? I won't go through the list, but every single one. Ibrahim Traore, right now, I think there's been about 5 attempts to assassinate him in Burkina Faso, right? So there's a massive hypocrisy and contradiction. We're told your leaders are bad, they're corrupt. At the same time, when we get good leaders, they're assassinated. That's number one. Number two, I always say, I'd rather have, if you're in Kibera, in the largest slum in Africa, do you want to be able to criticize Ruto and tell him to go to hell? Or do you want to make sure that your children have food, have health, and have education? What is your priority? To be able to criticize and public participation and not get jailed because you've told Ruto to go to hell? Or to get those basic services and to know your children are safe in Kibera and they're not going to be raped, right? So, it's so nice to be sitting in your ivory tower in London and DC and say, oh, we need to work on good governance. No, you need to work on basic services. And I would rather any day have a Kagame, have a Museveni, have what was the guy from Ethiopia before he passed away? But these dictators, if they're providing basic services to their citizens. If they're providing basic services to their citizens. I'm not sure Museveni is doing that, but if they're doing it. I would rather any day have that, because that's what the average woman who's poor. I think these conversations around good governance and all of this is a conversation for the privileged. It's not a conversation for that woman. So if you want to engender trust between citizens and governments, we really need to get to the basics and meet the basic needs. And that hasn't happened. And what you're talking about, like politicians coming at election time, this is notorious in Kenya. I've lived in Kenya since 1999, and I hope, inshallah, soon I will get the passport. But I see that every year. During the elections is when the potholes are fixed. You know, they start working on road projects and blah, blah, blah. We see that all the time. So that goes back to that. Now, government funding from the global north and how that is perceived. I do agree with you on that. I do think that one of the things we do need to, we are responsible, we have to take responsibility for the part in the problem that we have. And that is inefficiencies, corruption, and those other kinds of things. In Kenya, I think for every 100 shillings that the government makes in revenue, 60 shillings goes towards servicing debt. So there's only 30, 40 shillings left for basic services, right? That's, yeah. So that we need to be very efficient in how we use that 30 shillings, those 40 shillings. And when you have corruption scandals, it's painful because you have so little left, right? And so there is some level of accountability what we have to have. But we also have to talk the larger chunk. The larger chunk is the 60, right? Let's not take our eyes off of that. And what the global north is really good at is telling us you have corrupt leaders who are spending away 10 or 15 of those 30 shillings and who are stealing it, rather than telling us about the 60 that we're using to service debts. And of that 60, probably 30, I think, 30 shillings is for the interest alone. Yeah. So let's numbers and facts have impact on the narrative and holding accountable the global north. So yes, we do need to be getting away from, I would love to see Ruto not run to the IMF and the World Bank for another loan to pay back the other loan. That's what he keeps doing. You know, I would love to see that he becomes much more efficient in managing that 30 or 40 shillings. But I also would love to see Ruto and the Global South leaders maybe joining hands with the Sahels and others and coming up with some different dynamics on how to pay that debt, talking about debt justice, using it maybe as a conversation for reparations, whatever it may be, to say, you know, you colonized us, this is the least you can do is wipe off our debt. But that's a very political and politically charged thing, and it's probably going to get him killed if he starts talking like that. But anyways, that's what we need the Global South leaders to do. Mali is on the path now to paying off all its debt. They've said that. A small country like Mali, if they can do it, there's no reason why Kenya can't.
And we saw at the recent CHOGM sort of event the demand from the former Commonwealth countries for at least a discussion around reparations, and the fact, I think it made it into the final communique, but you know, there's complete resistance to any meaningful engagement with a matter of fundamental human rights and justice, and a reparation for a system that has, for hundreds of years, has balanced the sort of dice against those people who provided the wealth, who enabled global north organizations and societies to prosper. So I think this is an issue that's taking center stage. We were talking about it at breakfast this morning. And I wonder, I mean, it comes back to your comment earlier about the role of INGOs and the sort of the true role of civil society for activism and accountability. What do you envisage? Because at the moment, we know everywhere we go, you see, you know, the branded sort of, you know, projects, the aid delivery. What would you like to see instead? If we're looking for a system of mutual accountability, of mutual solidarity, where we all have a meaningful role to play and contribute, what is the role of global INGOs within that? They have a lot of resources. There is insufficient resource in the system to really tackle some of these issues. So we want to retain those resources, but how can those resources flow in a more equitable way that promotes decolonization and fundamentally rebalances the power in the system? Simeon.
For me, I think as part of the reimagination of the INGO is to really look at how the practices and approaches are not contributing to disempowering others, that they are not seeking to take over agency of people who are on the margins of whatever system, political system, economic system, or social system. Often what you see, and I've seen it in my practice, like I wonder what is the role of an NGO to turn on and off taps in a humanitarian setting. Couldn't that role be better served by the people who know who needs water, and these are the people who live in the camps themselves? There are certain practices that have been done, like we rush in, especially in humanitarian context, to serve people. Are we serving people? Or are we contributing to their disempowering? So those with power, I think it's important to reflect on that power and how they can use that power responsibly in a very unequal world. And sometimes I think we do not have those deep reflections as INGOs. As we go in and provide services that are better provided by local actors. I also believe that there is a place for everyone, but not maintaining the status quo. We need to have genuine and meaningful dialogue between actors in the South and actors in the North. And those conversations can be very painful, but they will help us to get to where we need to be, where we can all be winners. I'll just end by one conversation I had in South Africa with my board, and we were in a room like this with refugee leaders. So we were told that as a funder, you are like petrol in a car. So, we had to what does that mean? They said, you are petrol, and be comfortable being just petrol. We own the bus, we know how to drive the bus, we know our destination. The petrol in a bus cannot drive the bus, does not own the bus, and does not choose the destination. And unfortunately, in our practices, we have this. And this is a quote, I don't attribute it to me. It came from a refugee leader who is from Somalia, by the way, who is a leader of the Somali Association of South Africa. And that was powerful. And I think my chairman of the board keeps referring to that. And when we are talking about resource allocation, we are always thinking, how can we be comfortable being the fuel, but not choosing people's destinations?
Thank you, Simeon. Degan, your reflections, please.
Yeah, that's Simeon. That's great. I'm going to use that from now on. Yeah, tell me his name so I can credit him. So INGOs, I think, like I said before, I think INGOs need to go back to the roots of what they are, which is, if they're really civil society, they need to act like civil society, and that means making some painful decisions about your money and your size. And that's really hard, because the CEO of an INGO is applauded and rated well for the growth model. Your metrics of success by your board is bigger you become, the better CEO you are. The more countries you plant your flag and operate in, the better you are. So it's a very imperialistic way of assessing CEOs. So and that also is not helped by the fact that we have seen INGOs corporatize. In a bid to do this profession better and improve quality, we've actually corporatized the system. And so you see people from McKinsey and Chevron and all types of places being on boards of INGOs. So that obviously fuels this metrics. So there is a disconnect between being real, genuine civil society that really appreciates that you are just a fuel to a local NGO, or you're just a passenger in the vehicle with that local NGO as an ally, and nothing more than that. But rather than you being owning the bus and everything else. Right now, they come into our countries as owners, they dictate, they tell us, we have these resources for this purpose. We don't design the projects with them. We don't even have visibility of the budgets. They'll give you $200,000, and they have a $5 million project, and they will never share the $5 million budget and proposal with you. And they'll give you $200 to do miracles. They'll say, be a MacGyver and accomplish the impossible with that $200,000. And then that $200,000, they tell you, oh, you can't get any overheads. You have to work for free. Yeah, right? I mean, this happens. So the same time the INGOs are financed and given unrestricted funding through these massive NICRA rates that US government gives them, some of them have 20, 30, 40% NICRAs. Harvard University a few years ago had a 40% NICRA. That's your overhead. So for every dollar they got from the US government, they were getting 40% for their overheads. Okay? I know that seems shocking to the Europeans, but that's how the NICRA rate works in the US. And then the European ones, the Dutch, the British, they used to have partnership framework agreements. You know? So you get basically a free money for 5 years, you're guaranteed. It's stopping now with these conservative governments, and now they're crying and they're trying to figure out, well, how they're gonna exist without it, because they've ballooned and become big and kind of lazy, I think, and inefficient, and they're not gonna get that free money anymore. So now the people are crying and saying, is this gonna hurt our localization agenda and our decolonization efforts and blah, 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 we can't be. I'm like, no, I'm sorry. That's you built that, you lay in the bed that you built for yourself. I'm sitting here trying to figure out how to keep the lights on as a local organization. I cannot be involved in your financial potential peril. I think of it as a good opportunity. I would say, as an INGO now, you need to be saying, okay, do I need to exist? If I'm really about decolonizing myself as an institution, do I need to be in this business for the next 100 years, 200 years? There is no exit strategy for an INGO. You will never find an INGO. I found an INGO who said, oh, we have been working with partners in Turkana, which is a county in Kenya, for 30 years, as if they were proud. And I said, what? Why are you in Turkana for 30 years? At some point, shouldn't you not be leaving Turkana? At some point, shouldn't you be handing that program to your local partners? They were saying, and this is a good INGO, this is considered one of the best. They were like, we support our partners and we've been there for 30 years and we are giving them unrestricted funding. And blah. I said, at some point, you need to get out of Turkana and introduce your donors to your partners so you're no longer in Turkana and get out of the way. That, to me, is an example of real change, you know? So this is why we have this thing called the Pledge for Change, where we have tried to work with the INGOs. There's 13 signatories, and they made commitments in 3 areas. One is an equitable partnership to address these issues around giving unrestricted funding, overhead funding to their partners, designing the projects with them, not bringing things from top down. And the second commitment is around storytelling. This is things like poverty porn. I'm looking forward to the day that they stop fundraising on these terrible images of Black and brown children and women. And the third is on influencing, how it's their responsibility to influence their back donor. It is not my responsibility to change the behavior of FCDO and USAID. It is your responsibility as American NGOs to change USAID, not me. But we are in the position now, with the NEAR network and others, to do this advocacy. So if you're really an ally, you should be holding your governments accountable and you should be working to change them. But that's very hard when 70% of your budget comes from that donor.
Thank you, Degan. And I know we've got a question from Katie.
Thank you very much for both of your presentations. Reflecting on this, we all see that there are massive problems in the system. At the overarching level, we see that multilateral collaboration is at risk of fracturing. If we look at resources, we see that recently, up until now, elections all over the world have been resulting in less bilateral aid. And we just had an election in a country that temporarily still represents 25% of global GDP. And that election will probably result in even less bilateral aid. And then if we look at philanthropy, philanthropy is overwhelmed by the poly crisis. And the scale of social causes, like philanthropic resources, are a tiny percentage. They cannot scale, and there's not enough philanthropic resources to really address the needs. We do see these trends of greater endowment making by philanthropies, but we also see philanthropies, for instance, a family foundation such as Porticus or many others, often made their resources through business. Somewhere now, or a couple generations ago, there was someone who was a very good business person, created extra revenue, and was able to put the extra revenue into a social cause. So what we see happening globally is, people predict that impact investing will outpace development aid by 10 times in the near future. So we see a number, even in this room, a number of INGOs going into impact investing, and we see some civil society going into social enterprises. But there are challenges there. Some INGOs, when they've gone in, their impact investing has flopped because it's a different mindset, it's a different way of thinking, it's different skill sets. And we see civil society trying to go into social enterprise, but this, there are business operating models. It may sometimes take different skill sets. And I'm wondering, how is it going in trying to take an NGO that's been successful in the development aid world and transform it into an entity that can operate businesses that generate revenue, that lead to sustainability? Like, how's that transition? How did the staff, what kind of other persons and types of human capacity need to be brought on, and what are the challenges there? And then how can philanthropy act strategically? We see a huge movement. Like last week was incredible. The scale of philanthropies that are moving into strategic philanthropy where they want to give catalytic capital. But catalytic capital to bring in private sector resources, 20 times private sector resources, it's not, simple, grant making. It's catalytic on things that bring in return. And so it's necessitating a different way of operating. So maybe from your perspective, how are you seeing catalytic philanthropy and its positives and negatives? And then from your perspective, how's it going? Trying to transform a civil service mentality and an organization into an organization that can generate sustainable revenue.
If I can just come in, we have had a conversation within Porticus in the last few, in our education board, about how to bring about change and how we see change happening. I like that you're looking at funding as a key ingredient. For us, it's not. Funding is just one of the ingredients. If we bring into this matrix the people's expertise, if we look at if we can build a movement of people who believe in a particular model of change, and recognize that funding is not the only ingredient to change. People have got lived experience, refugee women and young people and men can actually find solutions, and we need to enable them to unlock these other resources that we have never quantified in monetary terms. So achieving that change and scale needs to recognize that it's not only about generating revenue, it's not only about finding money, it's about unleashing people power, about recognizing the agents of others, about ensuring that those who have been missing in these rooms are in these rooms and they are reimagining the future with us. We are not the only important actor in terms of reimagining the future. And I've had very interesting, innovative ideas that come from the slums, from the refugees, from villages that we never think about because of our training. In the institutions of higher education where we go, we are taught to think in a particular way. But when you bring certain people who have not been included in these rooms, they challenge your own training. They challenge your assumptions. And I think this is the space which we need to be in, to invite all those, not the usual suspects, but people who have not been part of this designing. So as Porticus, what we are doing is, we have gone into a co-creation journey, which takes time, which costs money. So even reimagining this change will not be done on the cheap, and the bill has to be paid, and as a philanthropic organization, we have committed to paying it. But in each of the geographies and themes that we are working on, we are bringing together other funders, INGOs, IGOs, people with lived experience to co-create solutions. and to identify the assets and the opportunities that exist in each geography and to reimagine solutions in that geography. So I've kind of deflected from your question because it's around money. And I'm like, we need to also shift to think that solutions are not just about money. Money is, yes, it's needed, but we need to think with others and those that have been particularly on the margins of decision making.
Thank you, Simeon.
I agree with you with everything you've said, Simeon, but I also say it's about money. You know, I have been in the situation where, you know, I've had to let staff go because we didn't have the money. I have been in situations where we downsized our office because we didn't have money. I have been in situations where I cut my salary by 50% because we didn't have the money. I have been in a lot of these kinds of situations. So local organizations are really, really under-resourced and struggling. And we are, I would say, we are in a very privileged position. We are very blessed where we are now. But when I joined Adeso, my mother had not been on the payroll since the founding of Adeso from 1991 until 2003. She had not received a salary. I put her on a payroll for the first time in 2003 at $1,000 a month. Then I had to find money to put myself on the payroll at another $1,000 a month. You see, so that's where we have come from. So what could be catalytic? I mean, for philanthropy is making that real, serious, genuine investment in these institutions and helping to endow them. But it isn't always about money because you asked about the struggles, the challenges of transitioning from an NGO to a social enterprise and doing businesses. I would have loved to have had one of these donors, one of our philanthropic donors, second somebody in their investment team. I would have loved that. I would have loved for them to have given us the time of one of their board members in the private sector to help us think through our strategy. You know, sometimes there's a lot of non-monetary needs that are not available. They just think about grant funding. They don't ask us, what do you need beyond money, right? So I just never thought I'm a very daring person, but it never dawned on me to even ask and say, can I get an hour a week from your investment manager and just to talk to him about all the things we're struggling with and to advise us? But now I'm going to start doing that. So there's a lot of struggles with transition. We have a problem in the NGO space. We are other than local organizations who know how to do a lot with very little, once you start getting a little bit of funding, you become very complacent and you easily become very fat. And you have to, it's like the instinct is there and you constantly have to tamp down on that instinct to be fat. And we have struggled with technology and things that we are trying to put in place because we're doing it as an NGO. We're not doing it as a private sector. And I had to make some harsh decisions and be like, you know what? We can't do this in-house. We have to figure out how we hire a different team of people and maybe outsource some of this because we just don't have the internal capacity. So there's a lot of learning and struggling that we're doing in this transition. I can write a whole chapter, 2 chapters in a book around what not to do to become a business. I mean, I have so many great examples of NGOs developing tech when they shouldn't be developing tech, like things like that. So it's a challenge. It's really struggle, but we're getting through it now. It's taken us a long time. A lot of learning pains that I wish we didn't have to go through if we had had different type of non-monetary technical support that wasn't available in the space.
Wanted to follow up on that question. I smiled, and my colleague sitting in the crowd also smiled, because we recognize as a foundation that our biggest input to the work is actually not the granting; it's the non-financial support. And I would love to see situations where our southern partners. And by the way, in our education sector, we have completely stopped funding northern organizations and focusing on the global south. So to really get our partners to ask for this kind of support, which can be available in the philanthropic organizations. And also some philanthropies have got multiple channels of engagement, like we are into social change, social entrepreneurship. We have got other entities that are working on that. But if we are able to have these conversations, and I am from the South, so I also, but representing northern interest or philanthropy, but I've worked in the South and I know very well what it means to work in an organization. The organization that I started the conversation with could not pay my salary. When they could pay, they needed 2 people, and we had to split our salary 50% so that the organization can have these 2 people that it needed at one go. But I think what was important is this energy, this envisioning that was coming from the people in the organization that really ended up attracting more funding in the future. But certainly non-financial support is a key ingredient, and philanthropies and other funders need to think beyond just signing the checks, because signing the check is the easiest part of it, but accompanying your partners, being a critical friend to the partners, connecting your partners to other resources, connecting your partners to other funders, which we do quite a lot as Porticus. We have also looked at the core needs of the organizations, like deploying business advisors. I've done it a couple of times on the African continent, where we pay Pricewaterhouse to go in and apply their tools on this local actor so that they can unleash their potential. They can have good business strategies. They can start turn around their business and then make a profit and still pursue social change. So happy to exchange some of these initiatives. But I think we also, as a philanthropy, we are reimagining ourselves, and because of our agility, we are able to make those connections.
Thank you, and I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Hassan for one last question for the session. Thank you.
It's not a question, it's just a comment, and very quickly.
You're very welcome.
I'm Ghassan Isa. I'm the General Coordinator of the Arab Network for Early Childhood. And in our newsletter, we are still writing about Somalia. Let me say that thank you so much for what you have said. I from the old generation that started with the human rights and continued to the political explanation of colonization and NGOs things. So I'm very happy to hear what you have said. Two very quick comments is that, yes, I agree that UN failed humanity, and especially in Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and Sudan and Somalia and wherever you can say it. You can say it. Failed humanity. And there is a trend now that human rights is a joke. No, it's not. We are the defenders now of the human rights. And I think this is one thing that the new, if I want to say, the civil society should hold the banner of defending human rights, defending social justice, because social justice was devastated by the definition of the UN. and social justice definitely is not what the UN defines it. So I guess this is one place that we need to take as a mission. The other thing I want to say, I was very agree with what you said about the role of Africa, the role of regions. That's why I have been advocating for the issue of regionalize rather than international NGOs and then directly to localize. Okay, regionalize. Let us see the region, how to build a critical mass, at least for early childhood, for instance. How to work on because, as you have said, the regional networks, for instance, is like the bus that was talked about. So these are the two things: the human rights and social justice, and the regionalization. Thank you so much.
Okay, I can see we've got one question coming in sneakily at the back with Leah. Come on, Leah. Thank you, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you both for joining us and for your wisdom. If we were to bring it back to the room with MMA starting as a donor collaborative, but now it's a multi-stakeholder collaborative with local partners, INGO donors, what invitation or action step would you invite for us to consider in our ways working moving forward? Thanks.
I think that there should be some basic principles or things that INGOs have to sign on to be a member of this thing, of this alliance, MMA. One of them could be that you hold them accountable to how they're implementing the Pledge for Change. We have an accountability mechanism, and there's self-reporting, which we know they all, well, I shouldn't say that actually. CARE's self-report was quite honest of themselves. Not most of the time they're not. They always say how great they are. 1 minute, okay. But we also have other mechanisms. We have partnership surveys of the INGO signatories where the partners actually give feedback on them. And they're run by a Global South research institution. It's run by WACSI in West Africa. Then we also have a Global South advisory who reviews all the data, the surveys, the self-report, and gets feedback also from partners informally. Some of them are partners of these same INGOs. So the reports and in the end will be multifaceted. It's not a single source of reporting. That's what we hope to do. So I would love to see pledge signatories held accountable, because it's not enough that you sign on to something. There's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of things people sign on to, but there is absolutely no accountability in many of these things. And for me, the success and the failure of the pledge is about the accountability piece. And we can only do so much as Adeso. I need donors like Porticus and others to say, hey, INGO X, we're not funding you until, one, you're either a signatory, or two, you're already a signatory. I want to see your report from the pledge. How are you doing on these things? Because these things are speaking to everything that we've been talking about around partnership and what it's like to show up in our countries so that you are just an ally, not thinking of yourself as the driver of the bus. So that's one practical thing that I would like to say. And the second thing I think would be good, I always recommend donor collaboratives to think about, is it's important to have some joint ways of working. Maybe you already do that. I don't know enough about MMA, but joint initiatives where you as the donors and the partners, like maybe in a country or two, where you all say, in this location, Lebanon is a great example. You have representatives here from Lebanon, to say in Lebanon, we're going to demonstrate how we collaboratively work together practically in Lebanon. And let that be an example, a role model that we now can take to others and say, we've done it in Lebanon, why can't we now do it in other countries?
Degan, are you in my mind? Because that's exactly the conversation we've been having. And one of the things that I wanted to say today was that actually the Moving Minds Alliance, we can't be a member of the Pledge for Change, but we're going to sign up to become a supporter of the Pledge for Change. And that's one thing that we're committing to. Internalising those own processes and principles within our own ways of working with and through our membership, and I look forward to continuing the conversation to see how we can make that real. Simeon, do you have any final reflections?
So quick one, following on the last question. I think for me, you as a movement, be ambitious. You are modeling something, and produce that as a public good. So it's not just enough to celebrate your own success and that we in the Moving Minds Alliance, we are like this, we are different from others. That's, I think, would be a failure. So be ambitious, model a public good, showcase it. In that regard, learn transparently. Be able to share on your failures, on the challenges, and not just celebrating the successes. I would say, lastly, promote voice and diversity, and be able to showcase what the stronger voice, especially for those on the margins of power and decision making, and also being a diverse group can be that model for finding solutions for some of the big social problems that our children are facing.
And we're going to be looking at exactly that in our next session. We've got a fantastic session lined up with RLOs who are going to be showcasing some of the innovations that they've been pioneering in their communities, focusing on ECD and emergencies, bringing to us ideas that we probably couldn't even begin to imagine because we don't live those realities and understand what those communities need. And these are processes and principles that the Moving Minds Alliance is committing to. I really don't think I can add anything to the incredible insights that you've shared, other than to thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think we've all been blessed and privileged to have this opportunity to hear your insights and wisdom, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.